The Honourable Chris Bowen, MP, Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bridget Hayward, official guests, Ms Eliza Mitchell, Mr Colin Ahoy, Professor Mike Wilmore, Mr Robert Heather, Dr Shang Gao, Mr Bryn Griffiths, members of the senior and junior common rooms of Earle Page College, members of the university and Armidale communities, and guests joining us via our online webinar. And I also offer a very warm welcome to Dr Page's granddaughter, Helen Schneider's knee Page, and other family members who are joining us on the webinar tonight. Apologies for this evening include the Chancellor, James Harris, Professor Rod McClure, Professor Mingan Chok, and Adam Marshall MP, member for Northern Tablelands. And I understand that Adam is also hoping to be joining us via Zoom this evening. So good evening, everybody. And on behalf of the University of New England, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 36th annual Earle Page Politics Lecture. Although it is a rather smaller and socially distanced audience than usual, we are very grateful that we're able to host this annual event, which is a highlight on both the University of New England and Earle Page College calendars. I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's lecture is being held on the traditional lands of the Anawan people. The University of New England respects and acknowledges that its people, programs and facilities are built on land and surrounded by a sense of belonging, both ancient and contemporary, of the world's oldest living culture. Let us pay respects to the elders of those nations past, present and emerging. My name is Kathy Hunt and I'm Head of College at Earle Page. This evening I will be your MC. I'd now like to call on Colin Ahoy, UNE Elder in Residence and a descendant of the traditional custodians of the land, to come forward and give the welcome to country.
Thank you, Kathy. Land is of great significance for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. When Australia's First Peoples talk about land, they talk about connection to country. Country refers to all the relationships that exist between an individual, their people and their ancestral lands, waters and skies. Australia's First Peoples talk not of ownership, but of belonging and connection to country. The country sustains them and they care for the country. Caring for country is intimately bound up with identity and respect. Country is crisscrossed by songlines or dreamings that provide Australia's First People with social, moral and religious codes and guides for interacting with the natural environment. The land where this university stands is the country of my people, the Anawan people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. And we share the caring of this country with the Gumbanga, Dunghutti and Kamilaroi people. I pay respect to the elders of those nations, both past and present, and I extend that same respect to each of you tonight, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. The annual Earle Page Politics Lecture is a significant town and gown event. This evening, we're delighted to have the Honourable Chris Bowen MP, Shadow Minister for Health, join us to deliver this year's lecture, Stronger on the Other Side, a Healthier Society After COVID-19. Minister Bowen, you're in very good company, with past speakers including various Prime Ministers and notable politicians. Yesterday, we received an email from a past speaker, Natasha Stott Despoja, recalling her fond memories of her lecture 20 years ago in 2000. The Earle Page Politics Lecture has a 36-year tradition of inviting politicians and political commentators to present a public lecture, to share their philosophies and policies, and to engage with university and community members. It provides a diverse range of political opinions and thoughts, with the ideal to listen, to hear, and to be heard. We're privileged to have this opportunity and for Minister Bowen to join us. The Earle Page Lecture Series and my college are named in honour of Dr. Earle Christmas Grafton Page. Dr. Page was the chairman of the Advisory Council of the New England University College from 1938 to 1954, and following this was then appointed the first Chancellor of the University of New England. Dr. Page was a brilliant student, entering the University of Sydney at the age of 15 and graduating in medicine with first-class honours. He was one of Australia's foremost political leaders of last century, being a member of the Federal Parliament from 1919 to 1961, and at different times as Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Treasurer and leader of the Australian Country Party. This lecture series is in his honour, and tonight we have the honour of Minister Bowen here. But I realise we also have a number of guests here tonight who are via Zoom, and there will be a Q&A session following Minister Bowen's lecture. Those on Zoom, please feel free to offer your questions on the Q&A tab. I'd now like to hand over proceedings to Dr. Shang Gao, lecturer in International Relations, Chinese Politics, Politics in the Developing World, to introduce the Honourable Chris Bowen. And Dr. Gao is also on the Earle Page College Senior Common Room, so welcome, Dr. Gao.
Thank you, Kath. Distinguished guests, Vice-Chancellor of University of New England, Professor Haywood, Faculty Dean of Humanities, Arts, Social Sciences and Education, Professor Wilmore, the head of Earle Page College, Ms. Kath Hunt, my fellow colleagues at UNE, students and community members. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Chris Bowen, Member of Federal Parliament and the Shadow Minister for Health. Chris entered Parliament in 2004 and has held a wide range of portfolios, including Treasurer, Minister for Human Services, Minister for Immigration, Minister for Financial Services, Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Competition Policy, Minister for Small Business, and Minister for Tertiary Education. Chris has been responsible for a range of significant policy reform programs in these portfolios. He served as interim leader of the Labour Party and acting leader of the opposition following the 2013 federal election and served as shadow treasurer. He is now Shadow Minister for Health. As we have seen throughout the course of the pandemic, health policy and health issues affect every Australian. I would like to personally thank Chris for his hard work, helping us deal with the challenges of the pandemic. Chris served on Fairfield Council for 9 years. He was a former mayor of Fairfield Council and a former president of Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. He has a Bachelor of Economics, a master's degree in International Relations, and a diploma in Modern Languages in Bahasa Indonesia from the University of New England. So we are very proud to welcome him back today as alumni. And I want to say this to my students of International Relations. Look at Chris and think about what you can achieve with your degree. Chris lives in Smithfield with his wife, Rebecca, children Grace and Max, and two very adorable Labradors, Ollie and Toby. COVID-19 has threatened public health and deeply impacted global economy. It has devastated industries such as tourism, hospitality, and tertiary education. Different government responses to the pandemic has been highly politicized and often been questioned for their effectiveness, such as case tracking, quarantine method, border control, and individual and community rights. In Australia, on one hand, we have witnessed the strength, unity, and resilience of Australian people and communities. On the other hand, there's still so much to do to improve our public health system, such as aged care and mental health care. We're also facing all the challenges related to future economic recovery and the broader effect of climate change to our communities. Chris today will discuss Stronger on the Other Side, a Healthier Society After COVID-19. He'll give us his unique perspectives on the challenges and opportunities that Australians face beyond 2020. Let us welcome the Honourable Chris Bowen.
Thank you very much. Long before this was an important university, it was the home of the Anawan people who have cared for this land for millennia and passed their teachings from generation to generation. I want to pay my respects to Uncle Colin and to all your fellow elders of this land, and thank you for your stewardship of the land. It's time, and of course, past time, that we match those words with deeds. The sad fact is we are not on track to close the gap of Indigenous disadvantage in our country, as we as a nation promised to do more than a decade ago. We can and must do better. Well, it's an enormous honour for me to have been asked to give the 2020 Earle Page Lecture. I particularly want to thank the university for persevering. It's not been an easy year to arrange such an event. We've had several dates penciled at various times, and we've had several full starts for various reasons. Particular hello to those who are joining us online and who would normally be here. There are several reasons I'm honoured to be asked tonight. Firstly, I'm proud to join the long list of distinguished Australians who've given this lecture, which of course includes Malcolm Fraser, John Howard, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. Second, tonight is a chance to celebrate the Earle Page College and the University of New England, and not just because both my wife and I are proud to have UNE degrees. Strong regional universities are a vital part of our economy. Our regions have to be a vital part of our economic future, and regional universities are an important part of ensuring that's the case, nurturing regional communities and innovation. And on a personal note, I want to pay particular tribute to UNE for its ongoing commitment to teaching Indonesian. When I decided several years ago to learn Indonesian, I turned to UNE. More and more Australian universities have closed their Indonesian programs in a massive backward step for our understanding of our region. We live in uncertain and unstable times, and a better understanding of and closer and less transactional relationships with countries in our region are vital, and language is an important part of that. And to my UNE lecturers who are here tonight, it gives me a chance to say, Ibu Indra dan Pak Z, terima kasih atas menghencariki bahasa Indonesia. Saya akan melakukan yang terbaik untuk terus belajar dan mendukung hubungan Australia dan Indonesia. Only Pak Z and Ibu Indra know whether I got that right or not. So, thirdly, I'm also pleased to honour Earle Page himself. Perhaps it's not obvious why a Labor Shadow Health Minister from Western Sydney should be invited to give a lecture honouring a country party Prime Minister. But in these hyper-partisan times, we should recognise that people of goodwill and achievement have sat and continue to sit on both sides of Parliament. When I wrote my book, The Money Men, which focuses on Australia's 12 most notable treasurers, I chose Page to be one of them. Indeed, I gave him mention as one of the upper rank of Australia's treasurers. And said of him, he was an anchor of stability in a long-term government and engineered long-lasting reforms to Commonwealth and state financial relations. Now, I'll share a little secret with you tonight. I hope to emulate Earle Page and join him in a very small and exclusive club. You see, Page is only one of 2 Australians to have served as both Treasurer and Minister for Health. The other was Stanley Melbourne Bruce, 2 Conservatives. No one in the Labor Party has ever held both offices, although I should note that the great Bill Hayden was Treasurer and also introduced Medibank, but he did so not as Minister for Health, but as Minister for Social Security. Both Page and Bruce served as Treasurer first and then Health Minister, exactly the pattern of service I hope to emulate. I want to do this because I understand that a healthier society and a stronger economy go together. A healthy society is a more productive economy. A good economy is a good society. They are one and the same. And this is really what I want to talk about tonight, using the jolt of COVID-19 to rebuild our economy and renew our society. Tonight, I essentially want to offer 3 propositions. First, that we must be better prepared for the next pandemic and must tackle other health threats with the same urgency as we have COVID-19. Second, that our health is shaped by our economy and our society, and that we must address the growing pandemic of insecurity in our society, the phenomenon of insecure work, the gig economy, which has real implications for the health of individuals and our society as a whole, and we have to be honest about this. And third, that all of this relies on good government, and that governments and alternative governments must learn the broader lessons of 2020. More, that we have to take the misery and dislocation of COVID-19 and make it a hinge moment in our history. We have to use the pandemic as a rare opportunity to reset our approach to governing. Unfortunately, pandemics are not black swan events. In the last 2 decades alone, we've had SARS, H1N1, MERS, Ebola, and Zika. And the most obvious lesson, the clearest lesson out of this pandemic is that we need to be better prepared for the next one, because there will be a next one. In the global world we live in, along with changing habitats and environments, this all makes pandemics a certainty into the future. And there's no reason to think that a future pandemic won't also present challenges even bigger than this one has. We've given bipartisan support to the government, indeed to all governments, state and federal, for the difficult steps that have been necessary to tackle COVID-19. But it's also incumbent on us to point out that we could have been better prepared. We went into this pandemic with less than one mask for every Australian in our national stockpile, and an over-reliance on global supply chains and a badly stretched aged care sector and healthcare systems in too many respects. And the pandemic further exposed well-known weaknesses in our healthcare infrastructure, like chronically underfunded and undervalued aged care. As the president of the AMA put it recently, COVID-19 took the world by surprise, but its effects on the aged care system were entirely predictable. But as important as pandemic preparedness is, we also need to have a broader conversation about the health of our nation. We have to treat some of the other threats to our country's health with the same sense of urgency. Since January, we've spared no effort in the fight against this virus. But year after year, we fail to tackle the other health threats that are killing too many Australians. We spend a minuscule proportion of our nation's health budgets on preventing chronic disease, despite the fact it afflicts 1 in 2 Australians and contributes to 90% of the deaths in this country. Every year, 1.3 million Australians skip primary health care because they can't afford it, and another 2 million skip dental care. In our public hospitals, 1 in 3 emergency patients are not seen on time. And perhaps most damning of all, we've taken no real action on climate change, despite the World Health Organization calling it the defining health issue of the 21st century. Now, I've already mentioned the impacts of these failures on our First Nations people, but they're also on stark display throughout rural and regional Australia, because it's a tragic fact that life expectancy falls as remoteness increases. Life expectancy is 82 in our cities, 80 in our regions, 76 in remote areas, and just 67 in very remote areas. People in rural and regional and remote Australia die up to 15 years earlier on average. According to the Commonwealth Fund, equity and access are the areas pulling us back from becoming the best health system in the world. We have all the tools of an excellent health system, but where you live and what you earn too often determines your ability to use those tools. So we have to be better prepared for the next pandemic, but we also need to treat other health threats with the same sense of urgency that we have COVID-19. That's why last week, Anthony Albanese and I announced that a Labor government would establish an Australian Centre for Disease Control. Australia is the only OECD country without a CDC equivalent, and experts have been calling for one over the last 3 decades. Now, a CDC isn't a silver bullet. We've seen tragically in the United States that the CDC must be accompanied by strong political leadership. But an Australian CDC would focus on pandemics all the time, after COVID-19 and before the next one, making sure we're better prepared. And when outbreaks do occur, it would provide rapid and consistent advice to governments, Commonwealth, state and territory. And as in other countries, an Australian CDC would have a broader public health role. It would work to control all diseases, be they infectious, like COVID-19, or non-communicable, like heart disease and diabetes. Because as I've said, other challenges threaten our health system and our health as a nation at least as much as COVID-19, and both deserve ongoing support and focus. Now, when we talk about health in Australia, we tend to talk about health care. As a country, we think less about why we stay healthy or why we get sick in the first place. But the conditions in which we grow, live, work and age, and the political, social and economic forces that shape them determine our health outcomes. One of the most important health thought leaders in the world is Sir Michael Marmot, who incidentally trained at the University of Sydney and Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, just like Sir Earle Page. Marmot calls these forces the causes of the causes. Not just whether we smoke or carry too much weight or eat badly, but the causes of ill health, why we do those things. More than a third of the health gap between First Nations and other Australians is due to those social determinants, like differences in income, employment and schooling. And when you add health risk factors like smoking, you account for more than half the health gap between First Nations peoples and other Australians. Or to put it another way, less than half the gap actually relates to access to healthcare services. So to improve the health of our First Nations people and all Australians, we need to address not just access to healthcare, not just the direct causes of ill health, but the causes of the causes. Socioeconomic position, early life and education, social exclusion, employment and work, housing and homelessness, the built environment. All these shape our health in powerful ways. If we're going to make a real difference to the health of Australians, we're going to need to move closer to a health in all policies approach. The World Health Organization says health in all policies improves the accountability of policymakers for health impacts at all levels of policy making. This approach recognises that policy decisions way beyond the health portfolio have health implications and must be considered when they're being made. And tonight, I want to focus on the most fundamental determinants of health. That's employment, both its existence and its nature. The first economic responsibility of any government is to keep unemployment as low as practically possible. This is particularly important as Australia suffers its first recession in 3 decades. That's why wage subsidies, which Labor suggested and the government initially resisted, have been so important in 2020. And it's why it makes no sense to cut them while we're still in the middle of a pandemic, because jobs, good jobs, are important for any number of reasons, including that they shape our health. It's well established that unemployment is terrible for both mental and physical health. And right now, that's particularly bad news for our young people. Between March and April, almost 1 in 3 workers aged 18 to 24 lost their jobs. 1 in 3. And while things have improved slightly as our economy has begun to reopen, the actual rate of employment for young Australians remains under 60%. Partly that's because young Australians make up more than half the workforce in industries that have been hit hardest: hospitality, retail, culture and leisure. And partly it's because half of all young workers and 80% of young workers in those particular areas are on casual contracts. And I'm concerned that as young people gradually return to employment, that figure of casualisation might actually grow even higher as employers hire young people back under new conditions. If we were to adopt a health in all policies approach, we should be very concerned about the health impacts of increasing casualisation and insecurity. More and more, when somebody enters or re-enters the job market, they get an insecure job. In fact, as the Melbourne Institute has really recently highlighted, Australia has one of the highest rates of casualisation in the OECD. 1 in 4 Australian workers is a casual. Half of those have no guaranteed hours. That's a problem for many reasons, including what Marmot describes as the overwhelming evidence that job insecurity damages health. It's not surprising that insecure workers faced increased stress anxiety, and other mental health challenges. Studies show that fear of losing your job is just as harmful as the actual experience of unemployment. Not as obvious, perhaps, but equally proven is that this sort of work has physical health implications as well. Taken together, 21 studies show a 34% risk of increased heart disease for insecure workers. And these health impacts are most prominent where job insecurity is thrust on people by circumstances beyond their control. In other words, exactly what we've seen this year. It's critical we pay attention to this, the nature of work in our shaping of Australia on the other side of COVID. We live in the age of the gig economy, the omnipresent Uber and other platforms to connect labour with people who need labour. They've brought convenience and efficiency for everyone, and that's pretty much all of us who've used one of these new platforms. And it's true that some gig workers, like for example Uber drivers, welcome the flexibility and enjoy the social interaction that comes with the job. Some, but by no means all. These platforms have stretched the relevance of industrial conditions and protections to breaking point. And that has real downsides for the many of those who have no choice but to subject themselves to this working environment. In her book, Uberland, Alex Rosenblatt argues that Uber and similar services have created, and I quote, a fundamental shift in what it means to be employed. Of course, she's right. In particular, she argues that these services brand themselves as job creators, but have decoupled employment from employment rights. A recent survey of Australian rideshare and delivery drivers by the Transport Workers Union bears that out. 3 in 4 of those drivers wish they were engaged to work in a different way, that they were employees, not independent contractors. When you take into account all of the variable and fixed costs and income, these workers make an average of $10.42 an hour. $10.42 an hour. In Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in 2020. Not even $100 for more than a full day's work. That's consistent with the broader evidence that 38% of Australians who live below the poverty line are actually in work. They're not unemployed. 38% are in work, but still poor. It's no wonder that 71% of these drivers are struggling just to pay the bills and buy groceries. And even at its most basic level, the health implications of insecure casual work are there for all to see. Sick leave is used for medical appointments and stops infectious people coming to work. But gig workers without sick leave, reliant on every gig to make up the basic income that they have, are likely to put off medical appointments, leading them to be sicker. And they're more likely to come to work when ill, putting their work colleagues and their clients at risk of illness. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that these precarious employment arrangements are an increasing risk to public health. Pandemic leave has had to be introduced in the teeth of COVID-19, but we have hundreds of thousands of workers without access to sick leave every day in the non-pandemic environment, and that's just as dangerous. And if, when these workers do become seriously ill or injured, they don't enjoy nearly the same level of safety net. Employers covered by New South Wales workers' compensation laws are entitled to up to $110,000 in payments for medical costs and ongoing weekly payments of up to $2,000. But for Uber Eats drivers, for example, medical payments are capped at $5,000 and weekly payments are half as much and for only 30 days. And it's not just that. Shift work has real health implications. Plenty of studies show it, and I know it. My dad was a shift worker all through my childhood. For many years, he worked permanent midnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., catching up on whatever sleep he could during the day. The health impacts of that are inescapable. But at least my dad and the tens of thousands of other shift workers who worked in that regulated environment in which the health impacts are considered and rostering and things like minimum breaks are built in to try and protect health as much as possible. Insecure workers, catching as many shifts as they can with different platforms and at all hours, receive no such consideration. Of course, insecure work can look different in different places. Rideshare and food delivery services are less common in rural and regional areas, which don't always have the critical mass of demand. But as you know too well, These areas have faced a different challenge in recent decades: the flight of human capital to cities and increasing precariousness of work for those who remain. And many young people who do leave the regions for the cities find they are thrown into precarious and insecure work on arrival. Whatever its causes, when the nature of work creates conditions where people can't meet their basic living and working requirements, then that's a problem for our health, our economy, and our society. So jobs, good jobs, are vital to Australia's health. Now, I'm no Luddite. I'm not suggesting that we should or could wind back the clock to an era before we could tap our phones for an Uber or ask Airtasker to help us find someone to do some paving around the house. But we have to recognise the real and cancerous impacts of growing workplace insecurity. And governments must consider how our regulatory system needs to be updated to deal with it. To me, this really comes down to a basic question. What kind of society do we want? A big part of Labor's mission for more than a century has been to avoid the development of an Australian underclass. Our system of industrial arbitration and protections and our highly targeted social welfare system were both designed with this explicit objective. Are we now to stand quietly by and say we're happy for such an underclass to develop because we think technology gives us no choice? I say no. This is not impossible. Unions New South Wales and Airtasker showed a couple of years ago what is possible when they, to the credit of both parties, struck a deal around basic protections for service providers on Airtasker. And as in so many areas, New Zealand is currently showing us the way forward. Jacinda Ardern has invited one of her National Party predecessors as Prime Minister, Jim Bolger, to advise her government on how to better regulate the labour market in this environment. And Bolger has freely recognised that the laissez-faire approach, like the one that he once championed, is not fit for purpose in this gig economy. In Australia, we need a federal government which doesn't use COVID to wind back industrial protections. We need a government that recognises that those protections should be refreshed and updated to reflect these massive socio-economic changes. We've dealt with the COVID pandemic well so far in Australia, but we haven't even started to tackle the pandemic of insecurity, with all the implications that this has for the health of Australians and our Australian society. Now, some might argue that I'm asking for a lot tonight. No, I plead guilty. I am ambitious for our nation. My third and final point is that COVID-19 has shown us what can be done by governments with the force of will. Good things can be done. Great things can be done by governments with enough ambition to do them. For a decade or so, Australian politics has been consumed by a series of toxic debates, most spectacularly on climate change, but on other issues too. Many Australians have come to believe that government is no longer interested in their lives or able to improve them. That's one of the major drivers behind the political disengagement that is now well documented. But COVID-19 gives us an opportunity to reset the political discussion and offer a new compact to the Australian people. Because our response to the pandemic shows what's possible when governments actually apply force of will to seemingly intractable problems. Let's take an international example. In Britain, the Conservative government had a target of reducing homelessness by 90% in 5 years. An ambitious target, some thought. When COVID hit, Whitehall was concerned that rough sleepers would become a vector for the virus. The 5-year target was met in 2 days. An ambitious target met in 48 hours. Similar story here in Australia. Out of the estimated 8,200 rough sleepers here, an impressive 5,000 were temporarily sheltered in the early weeks of the pandemic. Take a final example. Australia entered this crisis with around 2,000 intensive care beds across the country, intensive care beds and ventilators. That was less per head of population than Italy. That fear that ICU would not cope would be overwhelmed here, just as it was in Italy, is what drove so much of our action. It drove the effort to bend the curve. Now, to the credit of all involved, we now have around 7,000 intensive care beds, from 2,000 to 7,000 in just a few months. Martin Luther King talked of the fierce urgency of now. We've been living that fierce urgency all this year. When this approach is applied, when ideology is set aside, when prime ministers and premiers of goodwill can work together to fix an urgent problem, a lot can be achieved. But here's the caveat. Our response to COVID-19 has been effective because we've focused almost exclusively on the pandemic. Too often, governments try to do too many things. That's a particular problem for my side of politics, and other parties of the centre-left. We see problems everywhere and want to fix them all the time, straight away. But when we try and boil the ocean, we fail. This is one of the lessons of our time in government, and particularly the last election. I'm not arguing for less ambition. I am arguing for more focus, so that the effort and investment can be concentrated on the greatest challenges. And I've nominated some starting points tonight. It's often been said, perhaps too often, that you should never let a crisis go to waste. But it's often said because it's true. The COVID crisis has taught us many things. That we weren't as ready for this crisis as we could have been. That we need to be more ready next time. That investments in public health, including aged care, are just that, investments that pay back many times over when it counts. That more and more of our fellow Australians are facing precarious, insecure employment, and that this has implications for their health and the health of our country. And that when governments turn their mind to something, focus on it, cooperate with other levels of government, put aside pettiness, seemingly intractable problems can be tackled and solved. We should be less willing to accept that some problems are just too hard. Nothing should be in the too hard basket when we choose to take it out. All this leads me to the conclusion that we can and must come through this crisis a stronger society, an even better country, with stronger public health and more security in our working lives. And it's up to all of us to make it happen. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to endeavour to facilitate both a physical and a virtual question and answer session for about 10-15 minutes or so. And we've had a very active audience online, which has been wonderful. And I'm going to start with surmising a good couple of paragraphs of context and actually bring two questions together as one. Talking about the environment and air pollution challenges. Armidale itself suffers from some air quality standards, especially in winter with smoke in the valley. We're all quite aware of that in the CBD. This is a question from both combined Dorothy Robinson and Margaret O'Connor, which I'll surmise because there's actually reference to web pages as well. Thank you both very much for doing that. The context I'll provide is when Launceston's high air pollution came to the attention of the federal government, funds were made available to help clean up the air. The result was 28% fewer deaths in winter from respiratory disease and 20% fewer cardiovascular disease deaths for a cost of less than $30 per resident. Can't fact check that. Given the major health benefits for relatively small costs, would you support a similar program for Armidale?
Seems hard to argue with. Based on that evidence, it hasn't been raised with me previously, the Armidale in particular episode, so I'm happy to look at it in detail and happy, if I can, to work with the government on it. It does seem to me to be a strong case. These are real issues which affect people every day. I've got similar issues in my own electorate in Western Sydney, some parts of my community. The biggest issue we have is smells and air pollution from surrounding industrial estates. So this impacts on people's lives in a very real way. When you go outside and you get hit with air pollution and you just have to go back inside, it's a real impact on your lifestyle and your living conditions. So more than happy to have a look at that in a bit more detail, talk to my colleagues, the Shadow Minister for Environment, and talk to the government if we can, and it seems to me to be a strong case.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next question, and please, ladies and gentlemen, whilst the lights are bright, if anyone does raise a hand, I'll get to you now, sir, please.
I'm very curious. I've been living in Canada for the last 2.5 years, working in the tourism industry, and the entire industry, as we know, both domestically here and internationally, has collapsed. Ultimately resulted in my repatriation to Australia, and I can't thank the Australian government enough for arranging. I was on a flight of only 30 people back to Australia and compulsory 2 weeks quarantine. Obviously afterwards, it's now the realisation of my industry's collapsed, employment opportunities are limited, and also too the mental health effects long-term is going to be the big thing, because I'm now faced with a career uncertainty of, well, what am I going to do long-term? Because all my degrees, one of which is from UNE, is going to be, well, they're redundant now in the short term. Then long-term, what opportunities are there for the mental health effects of COVID-19?
Let me take that question in two parts. The mental health impacts of COVID-19 generally and tourism in particular, if I could. The implications are real and very material. And we've taken an already difficult situation with mental health, and it's been made worse by the pandemic. For all the reasons we all understand, I don't think I need to go through the loss of employment, for many people, the anxiety about the future exacerbating already existing anxieties about their life and their families. We've welcomed the fact that the government has extended the number of mental health consultations you can get for free under Medicare from 10 to 20. They originally only did it for Victoria, and I thought it should apply across the country, and the budget did that. I give that a tick. But more needs to be done. And more needs to be done more generally for mental health in Australia. At this point, I meant to say, isn't it great that we talk about mental health more? You've been good enough to raise it. A few years ago, nobody would have raised mental health. You didn't talk about it. Sure, that's great, but it doesn't get us very far, just talking about it. We need a revolution, not an evolution, when it comes to mental health. The government has a Productivity Commission report into mental health, which they commissioned almost 2 years ago to the day, almost to the day. But we don't know what it says yet. It hasn't been released. It should be released as a matter of urgency. And I don't mean to be too partisan, but it should have been responded to and released in the federal budget. That was the opportunity to do so. I don't know what's in it. I hope it's a very substantial report, and I can just say, yes, it doesn't matter who you vote for, you're going to get a big change in mental health. We'll see. We just don't know yet. This just has to change, and talking about it is not enough. We've been talking about it now for several years, but very little, frankly, has happened. We've got Headspace and a few things like that, and they're fine, but that's not a revolution in mental health care. In relation to tourism and other impacted industries, all I can do is say, please have a bit of hope. We will return. We won't return to exactly what we were, but we will start going places again, and people will start travelling again sometime. Now, the key to that is a vaccine. I'm an optimist about a vaccine. I think we will get one, and we'll get one soonish. There are around 200 vaccines in development around the world. That's the good news. The bad news is 96% of those will fail. That's what we know from history. 96% of vaccines that start fail. They don't work or have side effects which aren't acceptable. But that means 4% will succeed, and 4% of 200 is a sustainable number. And hopefully we get one soon. And you know, they say the AstraZeneca vaccine is the most advanced, and if that's what it is, it does. But there will be a vaccine. And then, of course, there's huge challenges to get it produced and distributed and administered. It's probably going to be a 2-dose vaccine. It's going to have to be distributed at freezing temperature. We're going to have broad distribution, and it is probably, from what we can tell, going to be a seasonal vaccine, more like the flu vaccine. You have to get it every year, not for life. But it will come, and when that comes, borders will open, and people. I think there'll be pent-up demand for tourism. I know people want to get out and do things. In the short term, although it might not be particularly helpful for you, Australians are travelling domestically more where it's legal to do so, within New South Wales and within particular states and territories. But Australians are staying home and stimulating regional economies on weekends away and holidays, and that's a very important thing. But your degrees are not wasted. There will be a tourism industry. There will be a hospitality industry. It will bounce back.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. There was a question from the lady in the back row up there, if you could speak up.
Yeah, sure. What do you think are the 1 or 2 policies that have come out of COVID that you hope or know will keep on going in the policy space, in the national space?
Thanks. I guess I'd pick two, one in the health space in particular, which is telehealth. Really, COVID has accelerated the inevitable transition towards telehealth by about 5 years. I think in 5 years' time, Medicare would have recognised telehealth and it was done very quickly. Not done perfectly, but I cut the government a very big amount of slack because they were moving very quickly. So I haven't criticised that at all. At the moment, it's temporary. It runs out in March. I don't foresee that that's sustainable. Australians are now used to engaging with telehealth. Now, telehealth isn't a panacea. It's not for everything. We still need some physical consultations, and we can't just say that because you can now Skype your doctor and he or she can be paid under Medicare, that you don't need doctors everywhere. There's still a need for physical interaction, but it does provide so much more flexibility for diagnosis and treatment. And I think that's something that's here to stay. And the other thing which I imagine is here to stay to some degree, we just don't know how much, and we certainly hope it is the government increased the New Start rate and made it job seeker, and a whole range across society said New Start wasn't high enough. Now, the official government policy is to revert to that, but I'm not sure that that's a sustainable approach, and there'll need to be some increase in the unemployment payments to people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I know there's two questions here, but I'm going to ask another one from an audience participant who's a colleague, Rob Field, who actually runs our campus in Parramatta, UNE in Sydney. And Rob, very happy question for Rob. Smoking being such a large contributor to bad health, should it be phased out totally in Australia?
Yes.
Well, I don't think you can make smoking illegal. As much as I don't like smoking, I actually have never had a cigarette in my life. It just doesn't appeal to me, and I know very much the health impacts. And I'm the treasurer who increased tobacco tax by 12.5% a year for 5 years, which they weren't very happy about. But I did it for health reasons. And I can't claim credit for it, but I'm proud of the fact I'm a member of the cabinet. I was a member of the cabinet which introduced plain packaging, which was a big decision at the time. It was controversial at the time, and we were taken to the International Court of Arbitration about it. That's how much the tobacco companies hated plain packaging, and it's made a difference. And it's now regarded as international best practice, and other countries have followed us. I support anything which reduces smoking rates, but I think that making it illegal based on the experience of prohibition of alcohol and other things is a big call. And I think it's much better to try and use other levers available. People are going to smoke. Some people are going to smoke, and if you make it illegal, it'll go backdoor and less control over it. So I don't think that's necessarily the answer, but if there's other good ideas about how to reduce smoking rates, I'm all ears.
And somehow in Armidale, we still see some of our college students affording cigarettes, which is unbelievable.
You lose tax anyway.
Question for the lady in the third row.
Given what you were saying earlier about insecure work and the impacts on younger people, I'd like to ask a question about perhaps more the opposite end of the employment spectrum. What would a Labor government, and what do you think any government could do to address the issue of discrimination against older job seekers or older workers seeking to retain their employment, given that women of 55 years and older are probably our fastest growing homeless demographic?
Yeah. Not probably, definitely. Older women are our fastest growing cohort of homeless people, which doesn't say much about our approach to these things, does it? It's not an endorsement. That's why we have expressed concern about the government's wage tax subsidy they announced in the budget, because it cuts out at age 35. Now, we're all for support. I'm also for support for young people, but if you put one group of workers at a significant advantage over others, we're already at a bigger disadvantage over 35s, I think that's problematic. So we have expressed that concern. Now, there are things there are various ways subsidies that you can think about, and there have been various points and there's arguments about how effective they are. Of course, age discrimination is illegal in Australia. Labor governments made it illegal, and other forms of discrimination. We've recently lost the great Susan Ryan, who introduced the Sex Discrimination Act in 1984, which we're very, very proud of. But of course, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Just because it's illegal, people find ways of doing it. I understand. So this is on our mind. I'm not here tonight to announce election policies, and it's not my place to do so, but this is very much on our mind. We can't be throwing people on the scrap heap at age 45. And that's a big risk of recessions that we're in now. You lose your job and you never get one back at age 40 or 45. And you use 20 or 30 years of working life. So we can't let that happen. It's not easy, but this is very much on our mind. It's been part of our critique of the budget, that the focus on wage tax breaks for young people, okay, understand that's important. But if it creates an unlevel playing field and older workers at disadvantage, we do have a problem with that.
Thank you very much. There's another audience question from the third row here.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You rightly mentioned at the outset that climate change is a major challenge for health in Australia and everywhere. And yes, it's arguably the greatest challenge to health, society, environment and the economy that this world will ever face. And so trying to link that with the main theme of your talk, I was wondering how the Labor Party is proposing to promote better employment prospects, improved socio-economic outcomes, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and thus combat climate change.
Well, just on the health impacts of climate change, before I move to the broader, this is absolutely real. I didn't focus on it too much on this remark. These remarks, because of course I'd still be going another hour. But I have said if I was Health Minister, I would create it as a national health policy priority area, which is a particular thing that health ministers can do. There's about 11 of them at the moment to say this is a priority area for health, and climate change isn't one. And that's I think negligent that it's not one, because even if we and every other nation in the world adopted the best climate change policy in the world tomorrow, the planet's still going to warm for some time and it's going to have health impacts. So we also have to have a health policy response as well as a climate change response. And the impacts of climate change on health are remarkable. Whether it is, and I talked a little bit about it, actually makes pandemics more likely as animals change habitats and come more into interaction with humans. You're going to get human to animal to human infection. It increases the habitat of vectors like mosquitoes, increases bushfires, we all know, increases heat waves. And already too many Australians die during heat waves. So this is very real for us and we need to tackle it. To your point about jobs and climate change, I agree. I mean, renewable energy is the cheapest form of new energy. It creates jobs. It is good for the economy. And we can be a world leader with our environment, but we just haven't been. And we've had, frankly, years of stop-start policies and policy uncertainty, which has really discouraged investment. The best thing we could do is get to a bipartisan energy policy so that investors know. We've been working at that. We've tried on multiple occasions to get to a bipartisan energy and climate change policy. So that investors say, well, I don't know who's going to win the next election or the election after that, but at least I can invest my $1 billion and know what the policy settings are. Until we get to that, it's going to be very difficult to get that level of investment. So I support a very strong, climate change policy, but I also support efforts to try and make it bipartisan, which obviously takes two to tango. And to do that, both sides, and enough of both sides, need to believe climate change is real and caused by human activity and should be responded to by policy. At the moment, we're not quite there, to be frank, unfortunately. But the scope is there to do it, and Australia is. Not only are we one of the most exposed nations to climate change next to our Pacific Island neighbours, but we are one that could most benefit from a resurgence in renewable energy investment.
Thanks, Chris. We also have another question from our online audience, from Stanley Tompkins, who firstly thanks you very much for your presentation and goes on to state that many economists advise that small businesses will be the engine room of the economy going forward, and asks, could you reflect on how a job can be given to this sector of our economy post-COVID-19?
Well, I think that I think the most important thing is making sure small businesses are still there on the other side. Many small businesses have found going very, very tough. And so there's little things we can do as individuals, things we can do as a community, things we can do as a university to just go that extra mile to support small businesses that are part of our supply chain. And, you know, I'd like to think we've all been doing that if we can. I do think, I agree, small business will be a very important part of the economic recovery. Now, we went to the last election proposing a tax investment write-off, a write-off for investment, not just for small businesses, but which small business would have benefited from very dramatically. We're very glad the government has adopted one in this budget. It will make a difference. We don't think it's enough, but it will make a difference and encourage businesses to invest. And if big business invests, small business will benefit from it as well as small business investing. So that's the sort of thing you can do. We are thinking about other things in the small business space. You know, I don't think, and we don't think, talk about the partisan debate for a minute, that small business should be a wholly owned subsidiary of one political party. It should be the concern of both political parties, because plenty of people work for small business. You've got to get that balance right, but clearly small business should be something which is important to the government and the alternative government, and it is for us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's a question from Robert up the back there.
I read something that in America, even when a vaccine is introduced, something like 20 or 30% of people won't take the vaccine. With this combination of science denialism, conspiracy theory, and everything coming together in the context of a pandemic, how can an educational institution like UNE help to address this sort of growing issue within our society?
It's a big problem, and the universities have an obligation, and we as public policy leaders have an obligation to back the science. Now, I'll be very frank, part of the problem, particularly you refer to American data, is that it's being politicised. Now, I wouldn't take a vaccine unless it's been approved by the relevant authority. In Australia's case, the TGA. In America's case, the FDA. But I certainly would if it has been. So we've just got to back and support the central institutions of science and medicine, and say that loudly. And in Australia and in America, it's been particularly undermined by toxic politicisation of the debate about COVID-19 treatment, which undermines the vaccine, because the TGA in Australia says, for example, hydroxychloroquine shouldn't be taken, is not effective, and has potential side effects. It's people trying to undermine that message, which is undermining the TGA, which means when the TGA does approve a vaccine, that undermines that as well. You know, we need the vaccine to be widely administered for it to work. We need well over 60% and up to 90% of people taking the vaccine, if at all possible. So it really just comes down to, unfortunately, the science, whether it's climate change or vaccines or medicine, has become more and more contested over the last few years, and that's very unfortunate. I can't think of a better answer than saying we've just got to back the science loudly, as often as possible.
Very much, Chris. Obviously, a popular response.
Well, the science faculty, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've actually gone about 10 minutes over time, and as you mentioned, we could go for hours. Apologies, there was a couple of questions online that we've been unable to answer, but I'm also going to call a bit of rank here, because I noticed my Vice-Chancellor's hand go up with a question. I'm actually going to go, please. No? Okay. But I'm going to move on and say I'm actually going to invite our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bridget Hayward, here to give a vote of thanks to Chris for a wonderful lecture and evening. Thank you very much.
Bright lights. So first of all, can I just say thank you to the community of Armidale for showing your continued support for the university and the knowledge sharing functions that are really much part of our identity. So can I thank Colin for being here and sharing with us the importance of Indigenous knowledge and collaboration and engagement, very much appreciated. Can I thank all the people who put this organisational event. Events are complicated enough when you have to organise how many people are going to sit next to each other who aren't related but might in the same household, or how they haven't got a face mask and do or don't have hand sanitizer. It just takes it to a whole new level. So first of all, can I ask you to share my thanks for those that set up and organised this event? thank all the technical people who've made sure that this is not only about the art of human contact in the physical, but it's about the use of technologies to enable engagement, which goes to the landmark identity of the university I'll come back to. So universities should be about, in inverted commas, the critical conscience of society. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we allow for freedom of speech and academic freedom to be at the heart of what we do. And the Earle Page Lectures were intended as one of the vehicles to ensure that we as a university, despite our somewhat distributed mode of engagement, both in the normal and in the abnormal, that we participate in. So I think this evening has been one of those occasions when we can be very proud of the fact that we continue both traditions, but we also set new standards and new ways of working. So our traditions are about individuals who are educated in order that they can be full and effective citizens in society. That for me is the language of Madgwick, of the foundation colleagues that were here in Armidale who saw the opportunity for a new kind of university born in the regions and for the regions. And I'm very proud of the fact that we continue to stand up for that principle. Therefore, I'm particularly proud and grateful that tonight's speaker has in fact proven to be the perfect UNE graduate. And he's perfect for the following reasons. And not because he's going to give us an enormous check when he's treasurer in the next couple of months. I'll discuss that with you at dinner. Okay. So first of all, in this speech and in his answers this evening, he's addressed one of the priority items for us as a university, which is the health and well-being of remote, rural and regional communities. That we enable them through the power of education, we create opportunities through research and knowledge creation, and we ensure the effective translation through community activities and engagement. Minister Bowen has spoken this evening of mosquitoes. He's spoken of smoking, energy renewables, age discrimination. He's touched on the topic of women and homelessness. He's also, in inverted commas, talked about tax and investment. He's not willing to give up on smoking, but he's willing to object to it on the grounds of its health impact. He's talked about the opportunity for genuine bipartisan policy because it will have an effect on our climate change policies, and that will have an effect on the future of Australia and Australians. He's talked about the enabling function of SMEs and how important they are. And I thought he was just going to talk about science and policy, but he actually managed right at the beginning to show that because he's a UNE graduate and alumnus, that he also knows about culture. So he not only painted a picture of a current and future Australia, bound within, provoked by, but also stepping forward from one of, but not the only, pandemic of this century. But he also spoke to us fluently in a language of our community. It's very important that Australia plays a role in Southeast Asia and the Micronesian, Polynesian communities. And for a minister to stand here and reflect on the fact that he was able to be fluent in one of those languages and to share that with us is also a mark of a UNE graduate. Participate, be a citizen, connect and add value. He also spoke about fake news. Clearly, the real news is that we are in the middle of a pandemic that has challenged us in so many ways. He's shared with us the value of government policy when it's effective, mindful and purposeful, and what can be achieved when we share a will and a purpose, as opposed to the little that is achieved when what we all do is share opinions but not work to a common purpose. And I deeply appreciate the sharing of that message. UNE is 80 odd years old. That puts us in the age discrimination bracket, I hope. UNE serves over 70% UNE students represented by a 70% female participation rate. We are the university that represents the opportunities for women in society and for the value that those individuals can contribute as effective components of a modern Australia. We're sharing your concern about the recent budget and the impact of that on women over the age of 5. As a quasi-homeless honorary Australian, I don't live anywhere at the moment, as a quasi-homeless, mature honorary Australian, I am very grateful for the fact that you have concern about my health and well-being, but more importantly, that you've expressed a strong commitment for the connection between the well-being of individuals, their health and the success of Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the university, so that you don't have to fill out too much paperwork, here is a low-value gift, but it means a great deal to us. So it's a small recognition of the contribution we've made to our university, to the culture that we aim to support, and to the kind of citizens that we want to be in Australia. Minister, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and thank you also very much, Minister Bowen. It's been an extremely entertaining and thought-provoking evening. We appreciate you taking the time out of, I know would be a very busy schedule, to travel to Armidale and to the university to join us this evening. I'd also like to let you know that now, as our 36th speaker, your name will appear on the Earle Page College Politics Honour Board that sits in our dining hall. So you will live on in the college. I'd also like to thank those who've organised this evening. I know a lot goes into this, and it's been extremely challenging with working around COVID-19, but I'm sure you'll all agree it has been a very interesting and enjoyable evening, and I think a great success, so thank you to those who've participated. I'd also like to thank you all for coming along tonight, and to those of you who've joined us via Zoom, and thank you for your questions. They've been very well thought out, and appreciate the responses. This now concludes the 36th Earle Page the Earle Page Politics Lecture. And again, thank you all very much. Thank you.